Welcome to the Limitless Energy Podcast, and today it's my pleasure to welcome legendary sailor and marine writer, technical writer, Mr. Nigel Calder. Welcome.
Well, hello. Great to be here.
It's awesome to have you here in Reno. Have you been to Reno before?
No, I was amazed at how beautiful it is.
You've never been to Lake Tahoe?
No.
Sailed on the lake?
It's right now. There's snow on the mountains. The sun is shining.
It's gorgeous here today. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been a heck of a winter, but it's gorgeous here today.
Yeah.
So, Nigel, you've been a bigger part of my life than I realized because of the books that you've written. But I want to go way back before we get to your technical writing. So obviously you're English. You grew up in England.
Yep.
And at what point did the marine life become important to you?
I went to a Church of England summer camp when I was, I think, 12 years old. And they had a couple of sailing dinghies. And I got hooked on sailing.
Church of England summer camp.
Yeah.
Where was that?
No, I'm not the least bit religious. But it was, like other summer camps. It was a fun place. They had a couple of Wayfarer dinghies there, 16-foot sailing dinghies. And I just loved it. I got hooked immediately.
How old were you?
12, I think. And then at school, I hated organized sports of any kind. And it turned out that my best friend at school, his father had a dinghy on a flooded gravel pit close to where we had school. So we persuaded our mothers to take us sailing on Wednesday afternoons when it was sports day. So we got to go sailing pretty much every Wednesday afternoon.
And you just go by yourselves?
Well, my mothers took us, and then we go sailing on the dinghy. And then I sat there in high school dreaming about building a boat, sailing around the world. This was the 1960s when they had the first single-handed round the world race.
Uh-huh.
And it made headlines in England because it was funded by one of the leading British newspapers. So we all followed that. So, and there were the early cruising sailors like the Hiscocks, who probably even you were too young to remember.
Yeah, I don't know who you're talking about. The who?
The Hiscocks. They on a series of boats, they sailed around the world multiple times and wrote about it. And as they generated income from the books, they got bigger and nicer boats. And so a whole bunch of us got the idea we could do the same thing.
Okay, that's where you got the idea. Are they from the 60s?
This would be the 60s, yeah.
Okay.
And I went to college in 66. And there was a little bit of a hiatus.
From life?
No, there was a lot of living.
College in 1966
was pretty wild. We got into home brewing and some other interesting activities. It was the Vietnam War, even in England, that had an impact.
Right.
And then my brother had a boat on the east coast of England, a 26-foot sailboat. And in 1971, I met this rather wild American teenager and invited her to go sailing on my boat. I didn't tell her it was my brother's boat. And he was in Canada at the time. And we got on the boat, and she said, "Why don't we go to Amsterdam?" I said, "Sure." I had no idea how to navigate. That's on the other side of the North Sea. So we pointed the boat in the right direction, and I'm reading Eric Hiscock's Cruising Under Sail. He has a chapter on piloting, throwing up in a bucket, and reading the book and figuring out how to get to the other side of the North Sea. And the only chart we had was from before the Second World War. So we had some pretty good adventures, and on the way back we got run down by a boat. It didn't sink the boat, but it did a lot of damage.
But you made it to Amsterdam?
We made it to Amsterdam, and then on the way back we got run down. So then I had to go to work to pay for the damage. So that was my first paying job. I went to work in a car factory, working on the assembly line to pay for the damage to the boat. And I couldn't get near Terry, who was still with me 52 years later. I couldn't get her near another sailboat for about 8 years. So
she's your wife?
Yes. Yeah. So we built a couple of canal boats in England, and we lived on those for a few years. 70 foot long and 6 foot 10.5 inches wide.
So it was her idea to just go to Amsterdam, get in a boat and try to navigate.
Yes, right. We built these two canal boats. The English canals were built in the 1970s, the 1700s. And when they built them, it was before steam engines. So they were built for horse-drawn barges. And basically the biggest barge that a horse could pull was about 25 tons of load. And the standard size ended up being 70 feet long and 6 foot 10.5 inches wide. I have no idea where that came from. So we built two, canal boats that was 70 feet long and 6 foot 10.5 inches wide. And then we lived on those for 6 or 7 years. We both had a couple of jobs. We were totally broke all the time. The boats chewed up everything we could afford. And then in between, we would potter up and down the canals. And it wasn't, at that point, you couldn't live on a canal without a registered liveaboard mooring. So, but if you moved the boat every 2 weeks, you were considered to be cruising and not living on the boat. So that's what we did for 6 years, I guess. We moved the boats every 2 weeks in a loop down the Thames River and then around and through the Oxford Canal. And then when the canal authorities would chase us, we'd go back on the river. And then when the river authorities chased us, we'd go back on the canal. So we went round in a circle, basically, for 6 years. And in between, during our vacations, we would go exploring the canal system. It was actually, for young people, in their 20s, it was a great life.
Is your wife English?
No, she's American. Her father was in the U.S. Air Force.
That's why she was in England.
And that's why she was in England. And she had been in England for a week. And let's leave that bit of the story out. If I go there, she'll shoot me.
All right, well, I take it was her idea to move to the States. She brought you to the States. It was indeed.
She'd finally had enough of living in poverty. We used to go around the open-air market at the end of the market day and pick up all the vegetables that had been thrown away and stuff like that. And then every Friday we'd shake our trousers out to see if we had enough money to go down the pub and buy a pint. So it was a pretty tight existence. And she finally got tired of it. So we came back to the States. And then I discovered I could make 3 times as much money working in the Gulf of Mexico on oil rigs as I was making in England at that time. So I didn't go back.
You were working on the oil rigs.
Mm-hmm.
And is your background did you have some sort of chemical engineering background? What were you doing on the oil rigs?
As a kid, me and my brothers would get derelict motorcycles from the scrapyard and fix them up. I guess I was about 12 when I worked on my first motorcycle. And then we got pre-Second World War cars that we would strip the body off. We were in the countryside, and the farmer next door to us had a field behind us. So then we would strip the cars off and race them around the field behind us. And then after I wrecked my brother's boat, I got a job in the car factory. And then after that, I got a job maintaining large generators in a foundry that was off the grid. And they had 5 or 6 or 7 generators, the biggest of which was a 3,500 horsepower Mercedes engine that came out of a submarine that was captured in the Second World War. And then we had a couple of 2,000 horsepower generators and smaller ones, and a mixture of European and American. We had a couple of Waukeshas that come from Waukesha, a couple of British generators. We had metric, we had British Standard Fine, we had British Whitworth, we had every imaginable fastener under the sun on those engines, all different threads and different sizes. So it was quite an education.
Did you work on those engines?
Oh yeah, when I got there, the place was totally run down, and they were having several power outages a day. And in the couple of years I was there, we totally rebuilt down to the crankshafts, 2 or 3 of those engines. And by the time I left, I hadn't had a shutdown in 6 months, I think.
It makes sense.
I'm a little anal about maintenance.
Oh, clearly,
Yes.
Yeah, given your career path after all. But
Yes.
it makes sense given the fact that you have such a mechanical background. You've worked on engines. You backed into boating by...
And the guy that interviewed me for the job was one of those smart asses that thought he knew a lot more than he did. So he'd pop me some kind of simple question about engines because he really knew nothing about engines. And so naturally I could answer it. So then he hired me. So then at this point, I hadn't even done a tour of the plant. And I go in to a couple of the generator rooms, and these things, they're big enough to fill this space. And I thought, holy shit, I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. So then I had to do a lot of reading very quickly and figure out, I couldn't even tell which were the cooling pipes and which were the oil pipes. There's pipes all over these engines. So one of the first things I did was paint all of the pipes different colors for the different fluids that went through them. So it made these engines look kind of psychedelic, which was very appropriate to the times.
Did you learn from reading?
Mostly from reading, and then going in and studying these things, and then we had you had in those, I don't know what it's like on these big engines today, but at that time you could set the individual fuel injection processes on each injector, and then you you would look at the exhaust temperature, and then you would balance and everything out by doing that. So there was a lot of trial and error here. And after a couple of years, I got to be pretty good at it.
You ever break one?
No. We had a night engineer. He was on a Cunard liner docking in New York. And they have these wing controllers, on these ships coming into dock so they can see where they're docking. And they have engine controls on the wings. And they were just docking the boat, and he put a cover on one of the engine controls because they were all done, and he accidentally knocked it in full speed ahead. And the engineer down in the engine room, just did do and winds the thing up and drives the Cunard liner into the dock and takes out 3 feet of the bow of the boat and a whole bunch of concrete. So he ended up being the night engineer in the factory I was working in. And with those generators, you have to, when you've got 2 of them and you want to bring a new one online, you have to synchronize the frequency, the waveforms.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I don't know what it's like today. I'm sure it's electronic. But we'd had these discs that were showing the frequency and the rate at which they were going. And you had to slow one down and speed the other one up remotely until they were in sync and the 2 waveforms were aligned. And then you'd throw them in together. Well, he couldn't get the hang of it. And unbeknownst to us, he kept banging them in when they were not synchronized, which puts a huge shock load on the system. And he finally snapped the crankshaft on a 2,000 horsepower engine. I mean, we didn't which is the thing about this big around, and he snapped it clean in half. So we had to pull that one out and do a total rebuild on that engine. And we had another one that the crankshaft fractured on because of a bearing alignment issue. So I did total rebuilds on some of these big engines while I was there. And not just me, we had to get a crew in to help.
Uh-huh.
So by the time I was done, I had a pretty good idea how to run these things.
So at what point did you decide I could probably educate other people on what I'm learning here?
Oh, that was years later. That was, that was like 35 years ago. What are we, 20? So that must have been the 1990s, probably. 2000s, maybe.
2000s when you came to that decision? Well, I know that's not the case because...
No, probably 1990s.
1990s.
Yeah.
Well, so I didn't grow up around boats, but the girl that I met, who is now my wife, lived on a boat. And
funny how these happen, isn't it?
It's funny how it works out, yeah. So I moved on the boat with her.
See, it's the boats that do it.
I know, right? It's not the other way around.
No, absolutely not. I mean, look at the 2 of us. I mean, why would you think it might be the other way around?
But anyway, I moved onto this boat. I was a liveaboard. I'd never been on a boat before, and so the first thing I did, I started the engine, and a guy on the dock was screaming to me, "Hey, there's no water coming out the back," and I was like, "I know." I didn't know, but I pretended, and so then I understood that I had to go buy a book and learn, and this is the book. This is the book that I bought.
I just see that's the second edition.
Yeah, the second edition of Boatowner's Mechanical and Electrical Manual by Nigel Calder, and this is where this was my Bible, and I bought this in 1998. So I know it's in the 90s at least that you started doing this, but I pulled this out recently, and I had already met you. I knew who you were, and I was like, oh my God, no, I've known Nigel for 30 years. So this was my Bible. I have to thank you for doing that.
And it's almost twice as long as that one.
Really?
Yeah, well, this technology just keeps getting more complicated, but the old technology doesn't die. So essentially, I just keep adding rather than taking stuff out. There's almost nothing that's come out.
Well, what strikes me about the book is that everything is in such detail, and there are not only is there the writing, but the sketches and the photographs. Is that all you?
Well, the photos are. The sketches are. They hired an artist, the publisher, to take my sketches and make them look better.
Was this McGraw-Hill?
Many of the breakdowns are ours, but a lot more. For years when we pulled into, we would cruise, my wife and I, for 6 months of the year on the boat. Once we moved to the States, outside of hurricane season, we'd go cruising. We'd go cruising because we couldn't afford to stay on shore. And living on the boat, we never went into marinas. We could live on $300 a month. And then at that point, I had my diesel engine book was published, and the first edition of that one. and the royalty check came in twice a year. So at the end of September and the end of March. Well, the September one generally went to pay overheads and stuff. And by the end of hurricane season, I mean, it was in November, we were out of money. So then we'd go sailing. And the next royalty check would come in at the end of March. So we had no money between the end of November and the end of March. So we'd go sailing. But I would go around all of the anchorages we were in and ask everybody what problems they'd had. And then I would just accumulate all of their problems and sometimes get on board their boats and take pictures, but mostly just get information on what went wrong and how they fixed it and process all of that.
How long did it take to write the first edition?
Oh, it was 2 years. Yeah. Partly on the boat, at which point we had 2 babies. One was, when I first started that boat, one was like 4 months old and the other was going on 2 years old. And I have this ability when I'm focused to shut out the world. And I would drive Terry nuts because the 2 babies would be screaming on the boat. It was a 39-foot boat with the 4 of us, and I'd be working on something and I'd be totally oblivious. Mm-hmm. And then finally it got too much, so we moved ashore to finish the book up. And then we went and stayed in Montana one winter, and I hired a young girl. She was 17. She was, I think, the 14th child of a Mormon family. They had very large families, and because we're in Nevada, probably.
Yeah, we've heard of
right.
Them. Yeah.
And her mother was one of 17. I mean, it was a huge family, and this is back in the days of typewriters and Tipex and whiteout.
I remember, sadly, yes.
and cutting and pasting. So finally, I got hired her to retype the final draft of that book on a typewriter. It was the last one I did on a typewriter. And so she spent months doing that and got it into a form where I could send it to the publisher. And then the next one, I finally got one of the, do you remember the first Mac computers that were like this big with a 256K memory? And
was it Apple? The Apple IIe?
The tiny little thing about this big. It was like a little box. Mm-hmm. And then for $1,000, you could buy a megabyte hard drive that sat underneath it, which was this big square and this deep.
And you had the
external floppy drive.
The floppy drive, yeah.
So I did the next one on one of those, which was a pretty interesting experience. And then I had the whole thing finished and in Montana again, and I was proofing it. I did all the chapters separately because it was too big a file to merge. It took too long to save anything. And then when I was all done, I merged everything together into one file, and I'm going through it, and I found a double space between 2 words, and I corrected it, and then we had a power cut, and I lost the whole frigging file. And I took the computer to a guy in Billings and told him what had happened, and he said, help! And he managed to recover the thing, but mostly without any punctuation. I had to go back in and reassemble the whole thing from this huge string of words.
Sorry, he recovered everything, but with no punctuation?
Yeah.
So you had to basically rewrite
I
it.
learned about backing up.
Go through and hit space.
Right.
And okay.
That's when I learned about backing up.
Yeah.
So I gotten a little more diligent since then.
Valuable lesson.
Yeah.
You've learned how to navigate boats since then, right?
Well, in a somewhat clumsy fashion. We've done a lot of. We did cruising guides to the Belize area, Northwest Caribbean, and then we circumnavigated Cuba. The first boat that was allowed to do that since the Castro Revolution. They arrested us when we first got there because I had some, for its time, some fairly sophisticated chart making capabilities, and so we got arrested. And then they decided they wanted us to do a cruising guide because it would promote their nautical tourism. So the
Cubans arrested you, discovered how adept you were at making maps, they hired you.
No, that's why they arrested us, because I was making maps.
I see.
They held us on the boat for 9 days while they tried to figure out what to do with us. And then they decided they wanted us to do this. So then they let us circumnavigate Cuba. So we've made a couple of cruising guides, but in the process of that, we were using fairly crude technology, so there was a fair amount of running aground, which on occasion would drive Terry nuts. I do remember one time I ran us aground for the 4th time on one day, and she said, Nigel, God damn you, how can you do this right before supper time? So I learned that you don't run aground for the fourth time right before supper time. But but I have no problems with running aground.
Is that rule in your book?
That's in the book.
Okay.
So I have no problems with running aground as long as there's no wave action, because you can always pull off.
Right.
So
what was the sketchiest situation you found yourself in?
Oh, that was a serious grounding between Spain and Portugal just 3 or 4 years ago. We almost lost the boat. We had waves breaking over the top of the boat. That was a serious.
Between Spain and north,
there's a river that defines the boundary between Spain and Portugal on the Atlantic coast of Portugal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they get pretty big waves there.
They do, and the sandbars move all the time. And we had been in and out of this river 3 or 4 times, and every time I had saved the track on the chart plotter and then just followed it in and out. The first time we went in, it was flat calm, and we got in the dinghy and we sounded it and mapped out a route. And after that, we followed it. Well, overnight, the sandbar moved 30 yards, and we came out in somewhat rough conditions, and I thought, well, what the hell? We've done this 3 times already. I've got the track, and I just followed the track and ran us onto the sandbar. And if the boat wasn't so well built, we'd have lost the boat.
So you ran aground and the waves were big and crashing overhead. And how'd you get out of it?
With difficulty. Well,
with difficulty, yeah. I would have guessed, but
we have a
more specifics.
We have a powerful bow thruster on the boat, but I never use it. I forget it's there most of the time. For decades I've docked a boat without a bow thruster, and I just forget it's there. And I forgot it was there. I could have blown us off of that sandbar in 30 seconds with the bow thruster, but instead I'm working the throttles backwards and forwards, and I'm watching the temperature go up because the sand is being sucked into the air engine. And Terry's on the bow trying to throw a line to a fishing boat that's trying to rescue us. And the whole situation is pretty hairy because there's water coming over the boat. And because I forgot we had a bow thruster. And anyway, so the fishing boat pulled us off, but it did a lot of damage it destroyed the rudder and damaged the hull.
Mm-hmm.
We were lucky the boat didn't sink. So it was a rather expensive repair job. But, there's all of those other times where you're in a spectacular anchorage, or there's whales breaching alongside you. There was a time in the Gulf of Mexico when we're basically becalmed, and 2 or 3 sperm whales come up alongside of us. They're twice the length of the boat.
Mm-hmm.
And so Terry and the crew jumped overboard to go swimming with them, and it just kind of went down and came up again a little further off. And I mean, there's all these totally spectacular.
Usually they're wonderful stories.
You don't get, and we have twice now been in anchorages where wild dolphins came up and wanted to play. The first time the kids were quite young, and they jumped overboard, and this dolphin is butting them and then laying on his back to have its stomach scratched. This is a wild dolphin. And then our daughter was about, she's 7 or 8 at that time. She was getting a little cold, so she starts climbing the ladder to get out of the boat, and the dolphin wasn't through playing, came up behind her and butted her in the back and knocked her back in the water so I could play some more with her. And then it quit playing, and it went down to the anchor, and it came back up, and it went down again, and it came back up, and I thought, what the hell's going on? I was busy taking pictures of Terry and the kids, and I realized the anchor was dragging, and we were dragging towards a reef, and the dolphin was letting us know. So we reset the anchor, and it went back to playing with the kids. We've had that happen once before. When we were doing the cruising guide to the Northwest Caribbean, we were trying to get in and out of reef anchorages. And the charts then were made in the 1830s by the British. I mean, there's been no new charting since then on that coastline, 1830s and 1840s. So it looked like there might be an entrance in the reef there, and I was searching for it. And we had a school of little spinner dolphins playing in the bow wave, like a dozen of them. And I went into what I thought was an entrance, and the dolphins just went crazy. They're all jumping out of the water and acting nuts. So I realized there probably wasn't an entry, and I turned away, and they settled down again, and then I tried again, and they did the same thing. I mean, they were just telling us, you can't get this boat through that hole. You need to go somewhere else.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And that one dolphin recognized that you were dragging your anchor and was warning you.
Yeah.
Well, before we break from this podcast, I did want to give a plug for what you're doing today. So now you have a history of doing education through writing books and articles, but now you're doing something online with Boatowner?
Boatowner.com.
Boatowner.com. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I have for at least a decade wanted to put some of this stuff I've learned over the years onto the internet, but I have zero skills or interest in, frankly, doing that. And I met this incredible German PhD in computer sciences, who's also a sailor, who sailed on tall ships. I mean, he's just perfect.
That's a small target to hit there.
Yeah.
All right, you found him.
Right, it's taken me 10 years. Or he found me, actually, because he had the idea of doing a boat how-to, and got a hold of me. And the minute we started talking, I thought, this is it. And between the two of us, we've created this website, boathowto.com, which is subscription-based. Right now, it's marine electrical education, but we're going to do a course on diesel engines and diesel engine maintenance. Probably that'll be out by the end of the year. And though I say so myself, it's probably the most accurate and comprehensive boat electrical education that's available. And also, we attempt to shoot down a lot of the misinformation that you find on the internet. It's all standards-based, so American Boat and Yacht Council and the ISO. But the standards are solely focused on safety. If something is stupid or non-functional, they don't care as long as it's not unsafe. Mm-hmm. So our focus is on functionality that's standards compliance. And so it's a very different focus to what you'd get from going to, for example, an ABYC seminar. Mm-hmm. And it's so far.
And it's nice to update it. With a boat, you got to wait for new editions, but here you can just go up and fix things.
And then we have interaction with the audience. So if questions come up, we realize there are bits missing from what we've put out there, we can go back in and just add it in. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the beauty of this online process, is that it's very immediate. Mm-hmm. It's not like publishing, where you've got months between finishing something and seeing it in print.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, on that note, I look forward to talking shop with you in a podcast in the very near future. We'll talk again very soon. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you, Dennis.
Well, that's going to do it for today's episode. Be sure to subscribe to the Limitless Energy Podcast on any of your favorite podcast platforms.